Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back. This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I'm finally uploading some new content fresh off of the holiday slash break, if you will. But I've got some incredible numbers and data that I want to point out to you. I've got some charts that I want to show you. And this is going to be the most important update to the Pokemon TCG Pocket metagame that you will have seen for Mythical Islands yet. So without further ado, let's just get to it. So there's a lot more playable decks than the three that I'm showing you right now on the screen, but I want to kind of start off with just the basics of this kind of rock, paper, scissors type metagame, okay? So basically what we're seeing is that Gyarados is able to withstand hits and deal out one-hit KOs in some scenarios, or a lot of scenarios, against the Mewtwo EX deck. The Mewtwo EX deck is able to wall off or deal with almost everything in the Pikachu EX deck, and then the Pikachu EX deck is really thriving on Zebstrika and in some cases Electabuzz, the new Electabuzz, in using those cards to knock out Magikarp before it gets going and turns into that Gyarados. And even when it doesn't, sometimes that 90 damage so early with Pikachu is enough to really just kind of slow down and stymie the Gyarados deck. So that's kind of the big macro. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, what about all the other decks? So let's talk about that as well. So as far as the other decks go, this is kind of how I'm viewing the other players in the game. Now let's start at the top left and talk about Scolipede. Scolipede was one of the most anticipated decks that we have seen in terms of the mini set. And in the first weekend, it was played at a pretty high rate, but it just doesn't really beat that many decks. Now I'm going to talk about matchup data in the next part of this video, but just kind of going off its strengths, the biggest thing that Scolipede is going to do is it's going to beat Mewtwo. Now there are going to be some scenarios where it's able to beat some of the other decks sometimes, but a lot of the other matchups are just really bad. Like, just to be honest, they're really bad. Like, Gyarados destroys Scolipede, okay? The Golem deck can destroy Scolipede, obviously because of the weakness, but as well as, like, it just kind of, like, it's just, you know, the type matchup is hard to overcome. And again, I'll pull up data and numbers to kind of back up these claims, but the first thing that I would kind of start with is Scolipede is, like, it's pretty bad, okay? Like, I'd probably rather play Dragonite than Scolipede, okay? That's just the current version that we have right now that we've seen in deck lists. You know, maybe you've got some special brew or something, I don't know, but the Scolipede deck that we're seeing in a lot of tournaments is just kind of falling flat on its face outside of the Mewtwo matchup, but it's really good in the Mewtwo matchup. Now, let's head on over to the Fire decks, okay? So there's a couple of different variants with the Fire decks. So you've got your pure Charizard deck, right? You've got your pure Arcanine deck with Mew, so it's like Arc and Mew, and then you've got that fusion of Arcazard, right? And all of those decks pretty much can beat Celebi like pretty easily. Okay, like that's pretty cut and dry. Now, what gets really weird is that there are some matchups where the Charizard variant is tankier, and so it's actually able to handle a deck like a Golem a little bit better. Okay, but there's also some other matchups where, you know, Charizard just can one-hit KO Gyarados and withstand some hits from Gyarados as long as there hasn't been, you know, a lot of Greninja or a lot of Drud. So there's some weird, you know, things with that, but for the most part, you know, Gyarados is going to be able to handle most of these decks. And again, Charizard with the Arcanine, if you wanted to kind of bring that deck back, the Arcazard variant, I would almost say that you're better off playing 2 Arcanine and 1/1/1 of the Charizard line right now. That would probably be what I would go with if I was playing that Arcazard. But again, each different Fire variant kind of has its own benefit. But again, they mostly beat Celebi. And then Celebi, you know, it does have a positive matchup into Golem because of the type advantage, but there are scenarios where Golem can just deal with it. And the other thing with Celebi is it depends on the variant of Celebi. There are some people that are playing Superior, they're playing Celebi, and then they're playing Executor, but in all reality, the best variant probably doesn't play Delmice. The best variant right now, if I had to pick, would probably play Celebi and Exeggutor. I don't even know that I would try to go for the superior line because it's kind of iffy. But again, the best variant of Celebi right now plays Exeggutor. And one of the reasons why Exeggutor is good is because it does help out that Golem matchup, because Golem can't necessarily one-shot alone. The Exeggutor, it allows you to swing with your Exeggutor and then pivot out of it. So again, there's some flexibility there. And then again, like there's some cool synergy where one energy goes on that Exeggutor EX, and then you're able to start loading energies onto the Celebi. So that way you can swing and finish things off with your Celebi while your Exeggutor chips things down or knocks things out. But again, as far as Celebi goes, Celebi is kind of, again, I prefer the Exeggutor version. It's a little bit, the Exeggutor version can combat and deal with some of the threats from Mewtwo, but I think that the superior version is a little bit weaker in dealing with Mewtwo, especially if you're not playing Exeggutor. But again, just kind of going through these matchups, let's talk about Golem. It took down the Ursi tournament. A lot of people were on Golem. And the biggest strength of Golem is that it can play Hitmonlee. Like, that's the biggest strength because it can take out the Magikarps, right? And then on top of that, I guess you could say the other big, like, quote unquote, actually the real biggest strength is that it's a one prize deck, right? So, you're able to knock things off or finish things out, with Marshadow potentially. If Drud gets, it pings it for 20, maybe you can deal 130 total damage, including the Marshadow. So there's all sorts of math that goes onto it. But Golem, what we're starting to see with more data in other tournaments is Golem has a little bit of an issue with potential Arcanine matchups. With those variants, and then with potential Charizard matchups. And then again, when you take a look at the Gyarados matchup, I would say, hey, sure, I'll give the advantage to the sniper, especially if people start playing 2-Hitmonlee, but the Gyarados matchup is still a little bit scary if you're not able to snipe that Gyarados, because again, like it's a weird standoff where Druds can be in the active, but here's the thing is Greninja can just start sniping and pinging things, right? And soften things up so that way, hey, maybe Greninja can come in and finish things off. Maybe you have 2 Greninjas in a Gyarados. Like, there's all sorts of things that can happen in those standoff games. But again, Golem has a fantastic matchup going into Pikachu, which is one of the big 3. But again, there are some deficiencies with that Golem deck. And personally, I do think it's going to probably... I think it's probably a one-shot wonder, probably. But again, we'll just have to wait and see. And again, like, this is just kind of a snapshot of the meta, and Gyarados is going to deal with pretty much all of these decks except Pikachu, right? And then maybe it has issues with Golem, maybe it has issues with Charizard, probably not because of the type advantage, right? Like Greninja plus type advantage, it does make it a little bit difficult for Charizard to figure out when to come in and attack things. So, and then obviously the Misty High rolls. So that kind of sums up the way that things are looking in terms of, the rock, paper, scissors of it. And like personally, I think that if you're trying to win a tournament, I think your best chances are going to be with Gyarados, Mewtwo, or Pikachu. Now, here's the riddle that you kind of have to solve. For Gyarados, how can you win with snipers out there like Hitmonlee and Zebstrika? For Mewtwo, how do you make your Gyarados matchup better? Is Jinx an answer? Is it an actual answer? And then for Pikachu, well, Pikachu has a Mewtwo problem, right? So how do you deal with Mewtwo while also still having your snipers in Zebstrika and maybe even Electabuzz to knock out those Magikarps? How do you balance that out? And then again, with Golem being out there, I mean, what are you going to do against Golem? So every one of those 3 decks kind of has its own like big bad problem. And again, for me personally, like Scolipede is just kind of bad, so I wouldn't be worried about that as a Mewtwo player. Even in the Scolipede matchup, there's ways to win. Obviously Gardevoir on curve helps, and then I think that Jinx does play a big factor. So I think Mewtwo decks playing Jinx is going to change things. I think Pikachu will probably lean more into the Zebstrika variants instead of these Pikachu and Raichu variants and the Electrode variants. I think it'll be a lot of Zebstrika and Electabuzz. For the Golem decks, I do think that they'll probably transition to 2-Hitmonlee. For the Celebi decks, I think it's 100% clear that Exeggutor is the best way to go, and Superior just might be win more. You know, it might be win more. I played a deck where it was Celebi Executor double Dredagon, and I was running Leafs, you know, and so I got to my 45 wins with that in one of my accounts. So, you know, and then the other curveball is, can you make Arcazard work? You know, can you add in that 1/1/1 line of Charizard? And then again, having 2 Arcanine, 2 Growlithe, a Mew EX in there, and then obviously the Moltres EX. Can you do that? Because it does give you slightly more room for some trainers, right? And that's the same thing with the Celebi Executor deck. You have more room for some trainer flexibility. You can fit in that double Sabrina line, that double Leaf line, whenever you're playing Dredagon, Celebi, and Executor. So again, all of these decks have potential plays, except Scolipede. I think that deck sucks. Okay? So let's get into the actual data and numbers. Here we go. So just taking a look at a couple tournaments from this past weekend. This is starting off with the Ursi tournament. But again, you know, the Mewtwo Gardevoir deck, it's really hard to factor in all these losses. Like, the one thing you have to do is subtract 1 win and 214 losses to get the real win percentage of this, and it's going to change it a little bit. So you can kind of do that on your own. I don't want to necessarily dive into that again. But, you know, looking at the Celebi Superior deck, again, this is not the one that's typically playing, you know, double Executor, even though there are some decks that are playing all 3 in one deck. But just kind of looking at this again, obviously a mismatch when you go into fire decks with Arcanine. Obviously mismatch with Charizard variants. And then, you know, kind of interesting, it's about 50-50 with Executor Celebi decks, which is kind of interesting. Slight disadvantage if you want to take it literally. And then again, going down here, I mean, Gyarados just deals with it very easily, so Gyarados is pretty strong into it. And then Mewtwo kind of takes care of Celebi as well. And then when you get down here, there was one pretty interesting thing with this, is that the Pikachu matchups, you know, 18-13, 10-7, 9-9, 5-2, you know, the Pikachu matchup seemed to be pretty solid, and then the Scolipede matchup was also pretty solid. So, you know, there's the little bit of a breakdown in some of the data that I was alluding to in the, you know, the flow chart kind of looking thing that I just showed you. With Scolipede, again, I thought that it was pretty weak against most decks. There's going to be some favorable matchups. For example, you know, you do see that Scolipede is roughly even into the Arcanine matchup with Moltres. So, you know, presumably Arcamew is that deck that it's talking about. And then obviously loses pretty, you know, at a pretty good margin to the Celebi Superior deck, and then loses to Charizard and Moltres. But the Arcazard variant, it did go 7-0 against it. So there is that. You know, maybe the fire matchup's not as terrible for whatever reason. And then scrolling down here, I mean, Gyarados just destroyed it. I mean, it had a 13-44 record against Gyarados. But again, against Mewtwo, you're looking at a 66% win rate. So, you know, hey, there is that going for it. You know, and then you kind of scroll down here, Pikachu Zebstrika, it had some issues with Pikachu. So, you know, if you're keeping score, you know, Celebi, you know, kind of maybe a coin toss against fire decks, maybe, but it's slightly disadvantaged. A big disadvantage against Gyarados, and it should have problems with Pikachu, and it has problems against Celebi, but it wins against Mewtwo, you know. So again, I just don't think that Scolipede is going to be a deck that, you know, I would be necessarily concerned about if I'm a Mewtwo player. You know, hopefully you don't pair up against it, and if you do, maybe you can squeak it out. When you take a look at some of the other decks, the thing with the Gyarados deck that you're going to see is that the only big matchup that it's going to really struggle with is going to be Pikachu, right? It's going to take care of a lot of these matchups. I mean, 25-5 against Arcanine and Moltres, 60-34 against Superior and Celebi, you know, 10-1 against the Executor and Celebi matchup. That's crazy. And then you start scrolling down here, and you notice the Mewtwo Gardevoir matchup has 70% win rate against the Mewtwo matchup. So, you know, again, this is one of those things. Is there anything that can be done to make that matchup better? You know, I think Jinx should help, but again, there's not a clear one-card answer, right? It's just not a clear one-card answer. Does struggle, obviously, into Pikachu variants, you know, from Raichu variants to Zebstrika variants, it struggled. And then against Scolipede, it just destroyed Scolipede, so there's that. But again, just kind of this should be reinforcing a lot of the things that I just mentioned in that flow chart. And, you know, hey, if you take a look at the Pocket Legends League, which was actually the tournament that was before Ursi's tournament this weekend, shout out to the Pocket Legends League, shout out to Ursi, love those two tournament organizers, great people there. But again, when you take a look at this metagame, you're going to see a lot of similar results, right? You know, for example, if I pull up Scolipede and Weezing, like Scolipede is going to be cleaning up against Mewtwo for the most part, but look at this record against Arcanine and Moltres, right? 2-12. So you start seeing those records 3-9 against Charizard and Moltres. And like, again, it should be pretty clear that the Charizard or that the fire matchup going into Scolipede is just advantageous for the fire deck. When you take a look at some of the other decks, again, Gyarados just destroys Scolipede, which is what we saw in the other tournament. About a 64%, 65% win rate against Mewtwo. But again, like when you're looking at this deck, basically what you're saying is, hey, I'm willing to play one really good matchup and hope that that's all I see when, you know, the rest of the meta is 70% of the decks or more, you know, 75% of the other decks you're just kind of like not very good against, you know. So again, I just don't think this deck is good. I think it was kind of like a one-hit wonder, but that's just me. Maybe it's going to have some good adjustments that people can pivot to. Again, Celebi and Superior, just again, that 130 HP for Celebi is a big problem, and it needs Executor. Like it just needs Executor. Obviously struggles into the fire decks with Arcanine and Moltres, and then again, as you scroll down here, you know, the Gyarados matchup not great. The Mewtwo matchup not great. The Pikachu matchup pretty solid actually. The Pikachu matchup's kind of interesting there. Kind of didn't expect that. I expected Pikachu to be faster and hit, you know, more consistently against Celebi, but in the decks that have Executor is kind of a nightmare for Pikachu, and then also Erica plays a factor in that grass versus electric matchup as well. By the way, if you wanted to take a look at some recent tournaments, so again, the big thing this weekend was that, this past weekend was that Golem was able to win a tournament. And we've started to see more results with the Golem deck. So, you know, just taking a look at this tournament, you saw a lot more people bringing Druddigon and Golem, which gives us more data, and this kind of gives you a little bit more insight into this matchup. So for example, here you're seeing that Celebi and Superior 8-7 against this Golem deck, that's pretty interesting, right? Because you'd expect that type mismatch to be a really big factor. Then you take a look at some of the other, matchups. Let's go ahead and see. Yeah, Gyarados and Greninja 13-10, so still advantage kind of into the Golem favor there. And then you see 10-9 against Mewtwo, and then you see 8-6 against Pikachu Raichu, 4-2 against Pikachu Zebstrika. You see 5-1 against Scolipede Weezing because Scolipede sucks. But again, you start seeing these matchups, pretty consistently. In other tournaments as well. And if we pull up one more tournament with this Golem deck, let's shed some light on this. Some people may not know this stuff very well, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm here, which, by the way, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch this content. I would definitely appreciate you hitting that subscribe button. It's my logo at the bottom right of the screen, and, tuning back in for some more videos like this. I do actually play the game too on these videos, so don't worry, it's not always me just talking. But right here, you can go ahead and see that in this tournament, Celebi Superior is 1-0. Let's see, Executor. Okay, that's not a real. So against the Charizard deck, it struggled right here. It went 1-4. Against Gyarados, it went 6-3. And then against Mewtwo and Gardevoir, 2-4. So there are some holes in that Golem deck that maybe can be addressed. But again, that electric matchup is just really good. So, and then obviously just bodying Scolipede 4-0 right here. But anyway, so there is the Golem and Druddigon deck, and you can get some more data out of some of these smaller tournaments, just kind of seeing some more performances of these decks. But again, I hope that this video kind of like shed some light on like the current status of the game right now. Let me go back to the chart and kind of wrap things up. Yeah, so again, here's the chart one last time as I kind of close things out. And again, I hope that now, seeing the data and then seeing the chart again kind of makes things make a little bit more sense. But again, just taking a look at this meta, it's really fascinating. I think Mewtwo probably has the most answers to fixing their problems. But man, Gyarados is a beast. The power creep in that 180 HP for a stage 1 is very powerful. So again, we'll just kind of see how things play out as this weekend comes around, and I'm looking forward to watching the results unfold. I'm looking forward to seeing how some of these decks take shape and how they adjust. But let me know what you think in the comments. What deck do you think is going to have a great showing this weekend? Is there any other decks that we're not picking up on yet? And again, I didn't cover things like Pidgeot EX just because I felt like it was so fringe, it didn't really matter. And I didn't even talk about the Gyarados variants, because honestly, Gyarados and Gyarados, Druddigon, and Greninja, it's just the better deck in terms of numbers, looking at all the variants of Gyarados. So yeah, that's that. But again, thank you for tuning in, and yeah, that's all I got. I appreciate you. Peace.